Good day. Today is Sunday, 8th December 2024, and as all of you can hear, I am once again suffering from a bad cough, and this has affected my voice, which, as you can all hear, is not as strong as one would like it to be. Just to say, I have been running a cough for several days, and this cough has been building, but in all other respects, I feel actually quite well. Well, given the cough, given the problems with my voice, I have given serious thought to not making a video today. But the tumultuous, the extraordinary events of the last 24 hours decided me to make a video after all. I can't pretend that it's going to be an easy task, and the video will probably be quite short. But anyway, here goes. Now, yesterday, Saturday, over the course of Saturday, 7th December, the Assad government in Syria finally collapsed. Damascus and Homs both fell to the various jihadi fighters, and reports started to circulate in the media that President Bashar al-Assad of Syria, the former president, I should say, Bashar al-Assad, had resigned and fled the country. And in fact, we saw film of jihadi fighters in Assad's residence, and there were also pictures of the Syrian Prime Minister meeting with officials, or if one could call them that, leaders of the jihadi insurgency, confirming the transfer of power and saying that the Syrian government, such as it is, would try to cooperate with the jihadi fighters in enacting that transfer. In other words, the whole political, institutional structure in Syria, the military, the bureaucracy, the government of President Assad have collapsed, all in the space of just under 2 weeks. The jihadi offensive began on the 27th of November. If anybody had told me on the 26th of November that 2 weeks later President Assad would have fled the country and the entire political system of which he was the central figure would collapse, well, I wouldn't have believed them. And I don't know of any commentator, analyst, or anyone at all, even amongst those who follow Middle Eastern events very closely, who would have expected such a thing either. So let's start trying to unpick some of the things that have happened. And I'm going to suggest that, again, in some respects, the most interesting comments about these events have been coming from the Russians, from the official Russian agencies, to be precise, from the Russian Foreign Ministry. And late yesterday, or rather early this morning, the Russian Foreign Ministry published this statement: "We are following the dramatic developments in Syria with extreme concern. Following his talks with a number of participants in the armed conflict in the Syrian Arab Republic, Bashar al-Assad decided to step down as the Syrian president and leave the country, instructing the government to transfer power peacefully. Russia was not a party to these negotiations. However, we call on all the parties involved to renounce the use of violence and resolve all governance issues through political efforts. In this regard, the Russian Federation maintains contact with all Syrian opposition groups. We urge all the parties to respect the opinions of all ethnic and religious groups in Syrian society. We strongly support efforts to establish an inclusive political process based on United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254, unanimously adopted by the UN Security Council. We hope that these approaches will be taken into account by the United Nations and all stakeholders, including in the context of implementing UN Special Envoy for Syria, Geir Pedersen's recent initiative for urgent, inclusive, intra-Syrian talks in Geneva. Additionally, Russia is taking all necessary measures to ensure the safety of our citizens in Syria. Russian military bases in Syria are on high alert. There is no serious threat to their security at the moment. So that was from the Russian government and from the Russian Foreign Ministry. And it was preceded by a lengthy and bad-tempered interview that the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, gave to Al Jazeera. It was one of the most defensive and bad-tempered interviews that I've seen Lavrov give, and it took place directly after the three-power meeting in Doha in Qatar, which was attended by the foreign ministers of Russia, Turkey and Iran. And the thing that struck me, again, most forcefully about this interview is that though Lavrov was clearly furious about the recent developments in Syria, and though he repeatedly said that those events violated the terms of a ceasefire agreed in 2020 and confirmed by a UN Security Council resolution, and though he repeatedly referenced Resolution 2254 and called the main insurgent group, the main jihadi group that has been conducting the operations in Syria, a terrorist organization prescribed by the UN and, by the way, classified as such by the United States, Lavrov, again, despite being pressed repeatedly by his interviewer, never at any point in the interview mentioned Bashar al-Assad or mentioned the fact that he was president of Syria or referred to him in any way by name. And I have to say, when I was reading that interview late yesterday, it was clear to me that Lavrov and the Russians had already concluded that Assad was out of the picture. Now, there's been much further discussion about what all this means, and I'm just going to go back to the Russian statement, the Foreign Ministry statement that I've just read out. First of all, it says that Assad, before he resigned, was engaged in talks with a number of participants in the armed conflict in the Syrian conflict. The Russians do not say who was involved in those talks, apart from Assad himself, and they don't mention the jihadi organization that they refer to as a terrorist organization. They say that Assad eventually agreed to leave the country and to resign as president, and they also say that Russia was not involved in the negotiations, was not a party to the negotiations. Now, in relation to the last, it has been the consistent position of the Russians that they do not interfere in Syrian domestic politics, that they do not choose the president of Syria. They have always resisted pressure upon them to try to get Assad to step down. But at the same time, they've never said that he is somebody that they entirely endorse as president either. They have always said that Assad's future is a matter to be decided by the Syrians themselves. So you could take these words, Russia was not a party in those negotiations, as simply restating the long-standing Russian position. However, I have to say that I also I cannot help but read anger in those words also. The disgust that I have been seeing for several days now right across the Russian media space, the independent media space, I should say, the Telegram channels, the blogging channels, the various reporters and commentators in Russia that have been discussing the conflict as it has played out over the last 2 weeks. The anger at the way in which Syria, the country which Russia went out of its way to support and supported strongly between 2015 and thereafter, from 2015 and thereafter, how the Syrian political and military system, which the Russians had supported throughout that time, collapsed with minimal resistance, and as the Russians see it, under minimal pressure. Now, the well-known Russian commentators, one of the Russian commentators who writes under the name Russians with Attitude, has said that one Russian brigade would have been sufficient to stop the jihadis in their tracks. That might be an overstatement, but it is actually a fact that the only actual resistance the jihadis faced from the moment they began their offensive on the 27th of November came from the Russian Air Force. Russian bombing attacks did inflict serious damage on the jihadi columns, but of course they couldn't stop those columns as they advanced. In order to stop the jihadi advance, what was needed was action by the Syrian army, strong defense by the Syrian army, of the sort that took place in Syria in the civil war, which basically began with the first jihadi assault on Syria in the summer of 2012, and which continued until 2020, when a ceasefire was eventually agreed. And that is something which we never saw. Now, that, of course, begs the fundamental question of why did it happen? Why did an army and a state that fought so tenaciously for their survival between 2012 and 2020 for a period of 8 years crumble so quickly and so unexpectedly, with barely a shot fired over a period of just 2 weeks? Well, over the course of these 2 weeks, I have been watching and reading and listening as Syrian commanders occupying defensive positions outside first Aleppo, and then Hama, and then Homs, and eventually Damascus as well, made powerful or seemingly powerful public statements that they'd created impregnable defense lines and that they were going to hold out and repel the jihadi fighters in preparation for the counterattack which they always said was coming. Well, after the fall of Aleppo, I thought that might still happen in terms of the positions that the Syrian army took outside of Hama, north of Hama. But once Hama fell, I began to have serious doubts. And frankly, as the news began to pour through late yesterday of Damascus becoming encircled, of more and more towns across Syria collapsing and falling to the jihadi fighters, well, it seemed to me increasingly as if the Syrian army, the Syrian commanders who were making these bold and strong statements were simply going through the motions, pretending to defend these cities, in fact simply waiting for the jihadis to come and basically to bribe them into submission with payouts big enough to make it worthwhile for them to basically give up and hand the cities over to the jihadis. In other words, there was no real resistance by the Syrian army at all. And that is ultimately what brought the whole situation in Syria to the point of collapse that we have just seen. So why did it happen? Well, if we now go to the various statements that have been made by the various parties, some of the most interesting have come from the Russians. And in particular, there was a three-party meeting of the Russian, Turkish and Iranian foreign ministers yesterday in Doha, in Qatar. And the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, proceeded to give a lengthy interview to Al Jazeera. And I'm going to say straight away that it was the most bad-tempered and defensive interview that I have ever seen Lavrov give. He was clearly furious and clearly at some level felt deeply betrayed by the Turks, obviously, by the Syrian military, unquestionably, but I sense by President Assad ultimately most of all. Because the thing that stood out for me when reading the transcript of that interview, which you can find on the Russian Foreign Ministry's website, is that despite the fact that the journalist from Al Jazeera was repeatedly referring and bringing up references to President Assad, Lavrov never once referred to Assad, either indirectly or directly by name. And that, of course, repeats the pattern that we have seen from Russian commentaries. Putin has never mentioned Syria or Assad at any point in the last 2 weeks in any public forum. His only discussions about the situation in Syria that we know about have taken place between Putin and President Pezeshkian of Iran and President Erdogan of Turkey. Rumours of a telephone conversation between Putin and Assad have never been confirmed by the Kremlin. I suspect, by the way, that there has been such a conversation, but the Kremlin clearly feels that it was very unsatisfactory and has therefore failed to publish either confirmation that it took place or a summary. And the Russian Defense Ministry, as I have said, on its Telegram channel, has consistently ignored the current flare-up, the events in Syria, and has never discussed them to any extent or to any degree. And I have to say that after reading the transcript of Lavrov's interview with a journalist from Al Jazeera, which you can find, by the way, on the Russian Foreign Ministry website, I concluded that the Russians have washed their hands of President Assad and consider him to be principally the author of this disaster. And the Russian Foreign Ministry, shortly after that interview, but as news of the fall of Damascus began to come through, they published a statement which I'm now going to read. We are following the dramatic developments in Syria with extreme concern. Following his talks with a number of participants in the armed conflict in the Syrian Arab Republic, Bashar al-Assad decided to step down as the Syrian president and leave the country, instructing the government to transfer power peacefully. Russia was not a party in those negotiations. So again, the Russians are saying Assad decided to do all of these things. We were aware of it, we were consulted, but we had no part in this. It has nothing to do with us. It's entirely Assad's own responsibility that things have played out in the way that they have. And then the report goes on to contain all kinds of things which, frankly, look slightly unreal when they're stated today. We call on all the parties involved to renounce the use of violence and resolve all governance issues through political efforts. The Russian Federation maintains contact with all Syrian opposition groups, which is an interesting fact. By the way, Lavrov, in his interview to Al Jazeera, had no hesitation in mentioning the fact that one of the opposition groups, the main one in fact, is a prescribed terrorist organization classified as such by Russia, the United States, and the United Nations. But now the Russians are saying that they are in contact with all Syrian opposition groups, which might imply that they are in contact with Giuliani and the group that he heads, which is the group that Lavrov was talking about. Anyway, the statement goes on to say, we urge all the parties to respect the opinions of all ethnic and religious groups in Syrian society. We strongly support efforts to establish an inclusive political process based on Resolution 2254, unanimously adopted by the UN Security Council. We hope that these approaches will be taken into account by the United Nations and all stakeholders, including in the context of implementing UN Special Envoy for Syria, Geir Pedersen's recent initiative for urgent, inclusive, intra-Syrian talks in Geneva. That is, of course, a complete fantasy. Additionally, Russia is taking all necessary measures to ensure the safety of our citizens in Syria. Russian military bases in Syria are on high alert. There is no serious threat to their security at the moment. So, it's difficult to read, again, this statement without feeling that the Russians are furious with Assad and are ultimately blaming him for the entire debacle. That he went behind them, negotiated terms of surrender, did not consult with them to any great extent. We are not party in those negotiations, as they say, and then quit the scene. Now, what did then actually happen? Why did we come to this situation? Well, I've touched on this in many programs that I've done on this channel. Firstly, if I may say, there was I want to address certain comments which have been made by Kevork Almasian, which I take a person I take very seriously, and obviously is much more familiar with the internal situations in Syria than I am. He makes the point that President Assad's refusal to negotiate with President Erdogan of Turkey made sense, in the sense that Erdogan's primary objective is to get the Syrian refugees on Turkish territory returned to Syria, and that there is not enough space in Syria to accommodate these refugees. And besides, many of them have jihadi sentiments, which could have proved very dangerous for the Syrian authorities. Then, of course, many others make the point that the Syrians have experienced bombing by the Israelis. The Israelis are taking some credit for this bombing. They're claiming that this did indeed have a decisive effect on the course of the fighting. Others say that Syria has been hollowed out by the Caesar sanctions imposed by the United States, and that US and Kurdish control of Syrian oil wells have played a major contributory fact in creating this crisis, this disaster. Well, I agree with all of this, but only up to a limited point, up to a point. It seems to me that these various points, the return of the refugees, the Caesar sanctions, the Israeli bombing, the US and Kurdish control of the oil fields, the existence of the sanctuary for the jihadi fighters in Idlib, which people also talk about. All of these do provide, obviously, essential background to understanding what has happened. But it does seem to me that they don't provide the ultimate explanation. They all assume that faced by all of these problems, there was nothing to mitigate them that President Assad himself could have done. Let's take all of these various explanations in turn. Let's start, by the way, with the sanctuary in Idlib. Well, as I understand it, by the time the jihadi offensive began on the 27th of November, that sanctuary had been reduced to a small stretch of territory along the Turkish border and the town of Idlib itself. It was hardly an effective or obvious base area for a successful offensive which could have ended in the capture of Aleppo. Besides, all reports, all analysis agrees that these jihadi fighters were trained and equipped and organized by Turkey, presumably in Turkey itself. So, given that this is so, they could have been trained and organized and equipped in Turkey and could have marched into Idlib, and probably the events would have played out in much the same way as they did. The sanctuary clearly played a role, but hardly, I would have thought, a decisive one. The Israelis did carry out quite a lot of bombing in Syria, but bombing hardly on the scale I would have thought as to cause a significant crisis for an well-organized and effective military. Ukraine has been relentlessly bombed by the Russians over the course of the last 3 years. Perhaps more pertinently, there's been massive Israeli bombing of Hamas in Gaza, bombing on an immeasurably greater scale than anything we have seen in Syria. There has been bombing by Israel of Hezbollah in Lebanon. There's been bombing in many countries, in many wars. Israeli bombing in Syria was never, in my opinion, anything remotely like the scale that would have been needed to cause the kind of collapse that we have just seen. A well-organized military would have been able to absorb it, would have been able to find counters to it. We have seen that happen in war after war. I don't think that this remotely provides a sufficient explanation for the collapse that we have seen. The control by the United States of the oil wells in eastern Syria did indeed deprive the Syrian government of a steady source of revenue. But again, that assumes that these oil wells are the entirety of the Syrian economy. Countries can develop without oil wells. They often do. There would have been surely ways to establish alternative sources of revenue, to do all sorts of things in Syria itself, which would have mitigated American control of those oil wells. It's not as if Syria is without resources. A large, youthful population, fertile land, ports on the Mediterranean Sea, and of course it has friends in Russia, in Iran, in China, in many places. The sanctions are a topic that is always brought about, and there is no doubt at all that the sanctions were a massive problem for the Syrian people and for the Syrian government. But again, countries have repeatedly shown that they have the ability to withstand sanctions pressure. If we're talking about sanctions pressure, Hamas in Gaza has headed a statelet, which has been under far more intense and prolonged economic siege than Syria has been, and it has still succeeded in creating effective armed forces which resist the Israelis still. And again, other countries under sanctions pressure have been able to do the same. The fundamental problem, the key issue, is my opinion, is not that these problems did not exist and that they weren't substantial. It is that President Assad himself doesn't seem to have made the necessary decisions to mitigate them. Now, one example of a possible decision which he could have made comes purely from certain commentaries I have read on the Russian side of the internet. I cannot say definitely that what I am about to say is true, but it is consistent with other things that I have read before and which I remember reading way back in 2018 when what these claims say is supposed to have happened. Specifically, according to these claims, back in 2018, the Russians, at a time when it looked as if the war in Syria was about to be won, offered to extend to the Syrian government a massive credit. That credit would have enabled the Syrian government to rebuild and reorganize and re-equip its armed forces and to take steps to revive the Syrian economy. But in return, in order to repay this credit, the Syrians would have needed to make economic concessions to the Russians, enabling the Russians to set up businesses and companies in Syria itself, to develop Syria as a tourist destination for Russian tourists, to develop other aspects of the Syrian economy in a way that would have been consistent with Russian interests. Assad apparently turned the offer down. Again, it's possible to see why. He could have said to himself that if he'd agreed to a proposal like that, he would have transformed Syria into an economic colony of Russia. And that might have been, in the short term, true. But by doing that, he not only denied himself a revenue stream in the form of this Russian credit, but of course, he also denied the Syrian economy of Russian investment and the establishment of businesses and industries in Syria by the Russians that might have employed local people and which would have provided some kind of mechanism to bring the Syrian economy back into growth. Now, as I said, I'm not absolutely sure that this offer was made, but I have good reason for believing that it was. In addition, I can remember how a couple of years ago, the Chinese also sent a strong economic delegation to Syria, headed, as I remember, by a member of China's Politburo. And it looked into Syria, joining in the Belt and Road Initiative, participating in the BRICS, doing all of those things. And the meeting took place. Assad received this Chinese delegation and nothing further happened. And again, it's difficult to know exactly why Assad did not work harder to persuade the Chinese to come and to invest in Syria. Almost certainly the Chinese were seeking assurances that Syria would take steps to secure a politically stable and peaceful situation in Syria. As we will see, achieving that required establishing some kind of dialogue with President Erdogan of Turkey, and as we will again see, President Assad refused to take it. And if we go a step further, some of these Russian commentaries are also saying that not only did President Assad refuse that Russian credit when it was offered, which would have been partially intended to help rebuild the Syrian army, but after the main fighting ended, he also started to dismiss the experienced, battle-hardened Syrian officers who had fought and won the war, and started to replace them with people who he thought more loyal to himself. Now, I have to say, about the last, I've seen this mentioned in many places now, and I think it might be true, but I have never seen it fully confirmed, and I'm not so familiar with Syrian military matters as to be able to say, in fact, whether it was so. But if it was, then I think that fact in and of itself goes far to explain the underlying cause of what has happened over the course of the last 2 weeks. Because it seems to me that what President Assad would in that case have done is replaced the army built up by his father, President Hafez al-Assad, with a new army officered by people who he perhaps felt were closer and more loyal to himself. The problem with doing that is that the older officers who created the regime, together with Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, were fiercely loyal to the regime and proved ruthless and tenacious fighters. Whereas the people that Bashar al-Assad would have replaced them by had none of that same sense of loyalty and had none of that battle spirit that their predecessors had. And that perhaps goes far to explain, as I said, some of the events of the last 2 weeks. Having said that, again, I want to stress, I don't know that this is indeed what happened. I've seen many reports to this effect. I think more likely than not it is true, but I can't definitely say that it is what happened. One way or the other, we always get back to the underlying and fundamental problem, which is that Assad consistently refused to do or failed to do the one thing which more than anything else might have mitigated the many problems that were piling up around Syria. Now, if we come back to the question of the meeting with President Erdogan, it is absolutely true that Erdogan was indeed seeking some mechanism to send the large numbers of Syrian refugees in Turkey back to their homes in Syria. And I can absolutely understand why for Assad that would have been a serious problem. But having said this, it's important to say that in reaching out to Assad, that was not what Erdogan was initially asking for. He was asking for a meeting with Assad, not an agreement with Assad to return the refugees. And meeting Erdogan would have been in Syria's obvious interests. Not only would Erdogan have been the person who could have closed down the sanctuary in Idlib province, but he was the person who could have enabled Damascus to regain control of its eastern territories and to push the United States out. If Syria, Turkey, and Iraq had come together and had agreed to squeeze the Americans out of eastern Syria, it would probably have happened. And establishing a dialogue with Erdogan, working with Erdogan to see whether solutions in the common interests of both countries could be found, would have been the way to secure peace. Now, obviously, a global agreement between Syria and Turkey would have taken a hugely long time. It might have been very difficult to come to agreements about the refugees. But then Assad, as so often happens in the Middle East, could have met with Erdogan, spun out the negotiations, working parties could have been set up, Discussions could have taken place in Geneva and other places to establish dialogues between the various parties. All of that could have been arranged, and in the meantime, there would have been peace in Syria, and if Erdogan had been persuaded that there would be some positive outcome to the negotiations, well, who knows? He might have decided to play along in a way that would have avoided the events of the last few weeks. It may be that in the end, the negotiations would have gone nowhere, and we would have ended up in the same kind of crisis that we are seeing now. But consider, there are reports that after the jihadi fighters captured Aleppo, they were able to put the electricity back on in Aleppo, where there have up to now been repeated power cuts. The jihadis cannot have achieved that by themselves. They will undoubtedly have needed assistance from the Turks to do it. What that episode demonstrates is that Erdogan had it in his power to switch on the electricity in Aleppo. He had it in his power to bring the situation in Idlib back under control. He had it in his power, as I've said, to help Syria resolve the problem of the Kurds. Given that Turkey is far and away the most powerful country, and given how Syria's own position was weakening, Assad was not in a position to refuse to meet with Erdogan and to discuss with Erdogan these vital things. And of course, had there been negotiations with Erdogan, Assad would not have been on his own. The Russians would have been there, the Iranians would have been there, probably the other Arab states would have been there also. If I have to say, I think in time, something probably, including with respect to the refugees, would eventually have been agreed. Now, as to why Assad didn't do this thing, I'm not going to speculate. There may be all kinds of reasons in terms of his own personality, in terms of pressure from members of his family and from other members of his entourage, deep dislike of Erdogan, deep mistrust of him, all of those things. But I will further say this: the fact that Assad was able to patch up relations with the various other Arab leaders, the Saudis, the Qataris, all of those who had also sought his overthrow, not only suggests to me that he might have been able to negotiate a genuine peace with Erdogan, but his refusal to do so, even as he had successfully negotiated with all the Arab leaders, would inevitably have been seen by Erdogan as a deeply humiliating and, in effect, a massive snub. And if there's one thing we know about Erdogan and his personality, it is that he doesn't take these things lightly. Now, I'm going to give a recent example of how Assad, in my opinion, failed to play his diplomatic cards as well as he might have done. A few weeks ago, less than a month ago, there was a major meeting of the BRICS states in Kazan in Russia. I remember reading commentaries somewhere, I suspect they were in the Russian media, indicating that the Russians were expecting Assad to come And as far as I'm aware, he didn't. If he didn't, I suspect it was because he didn't want to meet Erdogan in Kazan. Erdogan, of course, also being there. Certainly, no meeting between Erdogan and Assad took place in Kazan. Had Assad gone to Kazan, he would have been in a position to meet with the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians. He would have been able to meet with Erdogan himself. There would have been the first steps made towards a dialogue. A process of negotiation could have been started, and Assad would have been there amongst friends. I forgot to mention that Pezeshkian of Iran was there also. Well, to my knowledge, he didn't go. The Russians are said to have been very disappointed, and as I said, it seems that he didn't go because he didn't want to meet Erdogan. Had Assad made that deal with Erdogan, I suspect that the Caesar sanctions would have been significantly mitigated over time and would have eventually eroded away, as so many of the other sanctions that the United States has sought to impose over the last few years have done. Well, there it is. I understand the reluctance of many people to blame Assad himself for this disaster. As far as I'm concerned, he is a tragic figure. His courage and dignity and sense of duty was instrumental, in my opinion, in holding the Syrian state together in the face of the incredible crisis that it faced between 2011 and 2020. His stubbornness, his unwillingness to adjust to the situation as it has evolved, I think, is responsible for the way in which all that he achieved before has now been laid to waste. I'm Greek, as many of you know, and I can say that in Greek tragedy, a tragic hero is absolutely a person of heroic qualities whose own mistakes and miscalculations, mostly born of pride, are the cause of his own downfall. And I have to say that I think in this case we can see all of these factors play out in the person of Bashar al-Assad. Having said this, it's important not to overlook the fact that the tragedy of one man is very soon going to be overwhelmed by the far greater tragedy of the nation that he leads. Now, everybody who cares about Syria, which I do, must hope that despite the events of the last 2 weeks, the Syrian people will achieve that state of peace and stability and prosperity to which all people everywhere in the world are entitled. I have to say that as far as I'm concerned, that if that happens, it will be a triumph of hope over experience. Whenever there has been a collapse of a well-established secular state and government and a victory of a jihadi force in any country in the Middle East or in Central Asia. One can think of Afghanistan, of Iraq, of Libya, Somalia too. The result has been not democracy and stability and peace and progress and any of these things. Usually some kind of council is set up which is supposed to act as the transitional power. It becomes increasingly clear that that council has no authority to speak of. The authority having passed to the men with the guns. Usually, after a brief interval, sometimes with no interval at all, looting begins, public order starts to break down, there is engulfing chaos, and after a short period, a collapse into an east internecine wall that is often far more prolonged and far more violent than anything that preceded it. And I have to say, in all truth, that I see absolutely no reason why Syria should be different. Well, there it is. We can see the crisis in Syria play out. I hope I'm wrong in that assessment. I hope that this time it will be different and that something will be patched up. But if I have to be honest, I don't expect it. Now, having looked at the situation in Syria, I think it's only fair for me to say a few things about who the regional winners and losers in this conflict are. Well, as to losers, Iran and Hezbollah are obvious losers. One of the key linchpins in the so-called axis of resistance, the Assad government in Syria, has now collapsed. Most probably that will interfere with the supplies that pass from Iran to Hezbollah. Though I'm going to say straightforwardly that I suspect that Hezbollah by now has sorted out its own supply chains within Lebanon itself, and probably it will still be possible for the Iranians to send supplies to Hezbollah in Lebanon. After all, they do seem to be able to send supplies to the Houthis. But for Iran and Hezbollah, there is no doubt that the collapse of their ally, Syria, must have come as a profound and enormous shock. And they will feel that their overall position in the Middle East has been significantly weakened, as of course it has been. Now, the two big regional winners are, of course, or so it seems, Turkey and Israel. Turkey now has at least a possible prospect of establishing in Damascus a government favourable to itself, led by its own proxies, and Israel has now occupied, as far as I can tell, the rest of the Golan Heights, probably permanently, and has also seen the departure of the neighbouring state that had been most implacably opposed to itself. Having said that, chaos, if that's what we see in Syria, is a very dangerous and difficult neighbour. If there is chaos in Syria, that will result in more refugees flowing to Turkey, which will put Erdogan's government under even more pressure, not less. If there is chaos in Syria, what does Turkey do? Does it march into Syria and try to control that chaos? Does it risk, in that case, being sucked in to a situation it cannot properly control? As for Israel itself, it has lost a predictable, if implacable, adversary for a situation on its eastern border that is, to put it mildly, dangerous and unpredictable. And though jihadis right across the Middle East, as Craig Murray, by the way, recently said in a bitter comment that he wrote as the collapse in Syria was underway, though jihadis have never shown a huge interest in the Palestinian question, it might be unwise to assume that that will always be so. Anyway, one way or the other, though Turkey and Israel today look like the winners and might turn out to be, there is a risk that they might someday come to regret the fact that they achieved in Syria what they apparently wished for. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And what then of the wider powers? Well, first we need to think about the European Union, which I would suggest ought now to be considering the high probability that it will be facing another flood of refugees from the Middle East as chaos takes hold in Syria and as more millions of people seek to leave. That is an uncomfortable thought, but there it is. Previous refugee flows from Syria back in 2015 created a major political crisis in Europe. I suspect this time, if we start to see thousands of refugees pour from Syria and perhaps Lebanon also towards Europe, that crisis is going to become much deeper. But anyway, that's the European Union. The United States, well, they've long wanted to see the back of President Assad, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, the neocons, have finally got what they wanted. But the new president, the president who will soon be in charge, President Trump, has come out and said that as far as he's concerned, the Syrians aren't friends of the United States in any shape or form. He doesn't seem to like the people who have taken power in Syria now. He's made it very clear that his choice would be that the United States should not become further involved in Syria. And by the way, I construed his words as a sign that he still intends to withdraw the US troops from eastern Syria, despite statements over the course of today from the Pentagon, which of course is still headed by Biden-appointed officials, that the Pentagon intends to keep those troops there. So, despite the neocons very belatedly, arguably when it matters less, getting what they want in Syria, I think that Donald Trump probably does want to see the situation resolved in a different way. And we might very well see a US pullout from Syria, especially if his nominee, Pete Hegseth, does indeed manage to get confirmed as US Defense Secretary. What of the other major players? Well, Iran has lost its major ally in the Middle East. Reports that I've seen speak of profound shock in Iran at the collapse of this long-standing alliance that goes back all the way to Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, back in the 1980s. The Iranians undoubtedly have been significantly weakened by this defeat, and it remains to be seen what they're going to do. But the other big player is Russia, and here I'm going to guess that there's going to be significant recriminations behind the scenes. Firstly, the Russian commitment to Syria was relatively small. The Russian expeditionary force in Syria, if we're talking about the regular air force and military, at its peak numbered perhaps 5,000 men. However, it was very public, and of course, in connection with it, there was deployments of other Russian troops, Wagner fighters, and that sort of thing. As I very well remember, when President Putin made the decision back in 2015 to deploy the Russian Air Force to Syria, it was a controversial decision. It reversed long-standing Russian policy, which up to that time had been very clear. It was that Russia would never support any move in the UN Security Council that might open the way for Western intervention in Syria. That, as a Russian official put it, the Russians would never allow the agencies of the United Nations to become parties to a regime change operation in Syria, but that Russia itself would not become directly involved in a conflict in which it was not directly concerned. Well, Putin reversed that, and again, there were probably reasons for this. He was still concerned about the possibility of a jihadi state being established in Syria, and the way it might become a sanctuary for the jihadis in the Caucasus, who at that time Russia was still to some extent fighting. He was also utterly horrified by ISIS and its caliphate, and absolutely did not want ISIS to capture Damascus, the capital of the original Islamic Caliphate during the time of the Umayyad dynasty, which was established in the 8th and 9th centuries. And Putin also, according to many claims, which are probably true, did not want President Assad personally to suffer the same fate as Gaddafi had in Libya, Gaddafi having been brutally murdered there. And he was also persuaded, again according to credible reports, by the Iranian Special Forces commander, General Soleimani, who basically persuaded him that a relatively small commitment of Russian aircraft would be able to change the situation in Syria, as indeed, in fact, turned out to be the case. But as I well remember, this was not a decision that was universally supported in Russia at the time. Many people in Russia questioned why Russia should become involved in Syria at all, why Russian soldiers should be shedding their blood in Syria, which is not their country, why the Russians should be fighting to defend Syria when that was the job of the Syrians, and why Russia seemed to be more concerned with Syria than it was with what the Ukrainians were doing at that time in Donbass. So Putin's action came in for a certain amount of criticism, and one got the sense at the time, at least I did, that this was criticism shared by many people within the foreign ministry and the defense ministry in Moscow as well. Nonetheless, Putin's authority prevailed, and as we know, For 8 years, the operation seemed to go extremely well. And that stilled some of the criticism of it. Well, this time round, I can't help but think that there'll be all sorts of people who will come along and say to each other, and perhaps not directly to Putin's face, but will communicate their feelings to Putin fairly well. They will say, "I told you so." And of course, some of these voices are authoritative voices, and they will draw on the previous experience of Russia, or to be more precise, the Soviet Union in the Middle East. It's not often known outside Russia that between roughly 1955, when the Soviets began to engage seriously with the Middle East, the problems in the Middle East, between 1955 and roughly 1975, the Soviets made a major commitment to winning friends and influence in the Arab world. And all of the patient and hard work that was done during that 20-year period, at one point, superficially, appeared to have achieved a certain degree of success. Egypt, Libya, Iraq, Syria, and Algeria and South Yemen all appeared to be strong allies of Russia. However, the Russians rapidly found that despite their championship of the Palestinian cause, for every friend they made in the Middle East, they made at least 2 enemies. Egypt quickly defected, despite having been saved by Russia from Israeli attack during the so-called War of Attrition between 1969 and 70, and again at the tail end of the 1973 war. Syria, under the leadership of President Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad, ignored Russian requests to stay out of the fighting in Lebanon and intervene there. And following the rise of Saddam Hussein, Iraq also became much less reliable as a Russian ally. Fair to say that if the peak of Russian influence, Soviet influence in the Middle East, was achieved around 1975, by 1980, this had all collapsed and the Soviet Union had in effect been marginalized. Now, the situation is not the same this time. The Russian commitment to Syria has been much smaller. Even if one compares military commitment, far fewer Russian personnel were sent to Syria between 2015 and 2020 than were sent by the Soviet Union to defend Egypt in 1969 and 1970. And the wider Middle East, well, the Russians have been able to make friends with parties like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, who had been beyond their reach in the 1960s and 1970s. But inevitably, there are going to be people in Moscow who will say to Putin, maybe, as I said, not directly to his face, all that investment, all that time and trouble to try to turn things round in Syria, the deployment of the Russian Air Force there, the sending of the special forces there, the deployment of specialized military police units there, the concert that the Mariinsky Theatre Orchestra conducted in the theatre in Palmyra. What, in the end, was it all for? Now, the Russians have obtained 2 bases on the Syrian coast, in Tartus, at Khmeimim, the airbase, and in Tartus itself, where they have a small port facility. They had similar bases in Egypt in the 1970s. Those bases were quickly lost. The jihadis at the moment are saying, the jihadis in Syria at the moment are saying that they want good relations with Russia and might be apparently even open to Russia retaining those bases. I don't think there's anybody in Moscow at the moment who takes those assurances seriously. So the Russians are not over-invested in Syria. They can walk away. They will have to walk away. I suspect that they will take steps over the next few months to close their bases in Syria. They won't trust the forces that are now in control of the country. And all of that investment in time, effort, and prestige has therefore been for nothing. I think what this episode is going to do is make the Russians even more wary of involving themselves in the affairs of the Middle East than many of them already were before 2015. Once, long ago, I remember talking to a Russian who'd been to the Middle East in the 1970s, and he once said that trying to build a long-term strategy for the Middle East was like trying to build a castle on a foundation of sand. Pretty brutal, but I think that that is the sentiment that many people in Moscow today must have. And as for Putin, well, he is obviously been deeply embarrassed by this affair. His authority, however, remains intact. He can brush off this episode, but I don't think he will want to be reminded of it very often. And I think it unlikely that he will ever want again to speak to Bashar al-Assad. So there we are. That's my summary of the situation. Obviously, there's a huge amount for the moment that we don't know. Many of the speculations, they are speculations that I've indulged in over the course of this program, might not come true. As I said, we must all wish the Syrian people the best, even though perhaps none of us have high hopes in that regard. Now, at the risk of putting my voice under further strain, I am going to say a little about other affairs, because we've had actually a very important development, and that is that President Trump, or rather I should call him President-elect Trump, has now made it absolutely clear as crystal that he really does want to see an end to the Ukraine war. Now, he came to Paris. He attended the ceremonies for the re-inauguration of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, which was badly damaged by a fire a few years ago. Trump was received there as if he was already the President of the United States. Biden, an all but forgotten figure now, even as his defense secretary cobbles together another $1 billion aid program for Ukraine, most of which, from what I can see, consists of long-term contracts for future weapons production by US factories, military companies, which might not actually result in any real weapons for years to come. But anyway, President Trump went to Paris. Nobody's talking about President Biden anymore. And over the course of it, President Trump said that Zelensky and Ukraine would like to make a deal with Russia and stop the madness. There should be an immediate ceasefire. Negotiations should begin. He said that China can help, and if the conflict keeps going, it can turn into something much bigger and far worse. And the last, perhaps, is the most important comment of all, because it clearly shows that Trump really does want to prevent further escalation and is alarmed by the risks of what is happening. And he clearly is committed to some sort of negotiating process. Now, in the hours after he said those things, we've had some rather waspish statements from Zelensky. Zelensky said that he's not interested, in fact, in an immediate ceasefire. If Trump thought that, by the way, I should say that Trump met with Zelensky in Paris. Zelensky turned up in his trademark camouflage shirt and trousers, and was wearing apparently boots. Apparently some members of Trump's delegation took this very badly. But anyway, and thought that it was an inappropriate dress to meet the President of the United States. Well, anyway, Zelensky immediately came out and said that he did not accept and he did not agree to an immediate ceasefire. In order for there to be an immediate ceasefire with the Russians, there would have to be first security guarantees. And of course, in the last couple of weeks, he's made absolutely clear what those security guarantees that he's seeking are. He will settle for nothing less, as he has said, than membership of NATO. And of course, the Russians will reject that and have made it clear that they are going to reject it out of hand. In fact, Peskov, Putin's spokesman, recently said that for the moment, the Russians can see no basis for any negotiations, direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. And the Russians, since Donald Trump's words, have rushed out more comments saying that they are absolutely ready to negotiate with the Ukrainians. They have always been ready to negotiate with the Ukrainians. It's the Ukrainians up to now who have obstructed and walked away from negotiations. They've also challenged or disagreed publicly with Trump's assessments of the relative casualty rates in the war, both on the Ukrainian and the Russian side. I'm not going to discuss that in this program today. But the Russians have also said, that for the moment at least, and I think that this remains their solid position, if we're talking about a ceasefire, that ceasefire is dependent on the conditions set out by Putin in his meeting at the Foreign Ministry in June, being realized a complete withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the four regions, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk and Lugansk. And then, and only then, can there be a ceasefire, and then and only then can substantive negotiations take place. And a precondition for negotiations, serious negotiations, is a commitment by Ukraine that it will remain a fully neutral country and not become a member of NATO. Well, I think we can spend an enormous amount of time discussing what the relative negotiating positions of the Ukrainians and of the Russians actually is. But the key point is that Trump, for the first time since he won re-election on the 5th of November, has spoken publicly about Ukraine, and it is absolutely clear that he sees this as an extremely dangerous conflict, that he wants the conflict to end because he fears escalation, and that he wants negotiations and a ceasefire. He might have to make concessions to the Russians if that ceasefire is going to take place. But let's not, as I said, get drawn today, especially with my voice about to go into the details of this. The fact is that Trump has finally, publicly called time on Project Ukraine. From this moment on, the only question is not whether the war will continue, but upon what terms is it going to end. Russian terms, I expect, but regardless of that, Trump's wishes, the wishes of the future president of the United States, of the American people also, by the way, of the European people also as well. Their wishes now are clear, and Zelensky and some European leaders can be as unhappy with that as they wish, but I think that we can now say with reasonable confidence that we're heading to the end game. Well, this is where I finish my program. I did get through. I think this program is as long as pretty much all my others, even despite the issues with my voice. I'll be back tomorrow, hopefully sounding better. In the meantime, just to remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Please also remember that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. That's me for today. Hopefully I'll be in better voice tomorrow. Until then, have a very good day.